The trial of Mr. Brian Fitzgerald was fixed to come off in September, and of course there was much excitement in Melbourne as the time drew near. Great, therefore, was the disappointment when it was discovered that the prisoner's counsel had applied for an adjournment till October, on the ground that an important witness for the defence could not be located. Sal Rawlins had still not been found, in spite of the utmost vigilance on the part of the police and the offer of a large reward by Mr. Frettlby. The millionaire had maintained a most friendly attitude towards Brian throughout the whole affair. He refused to believe him guilty. All Australia and New Zealand rang with the extremely plebeian name of Sal Rawlins. She had become famous without knowing it, unless, indeed, she had kept herself concealed purposely. But this was hardly probable, as there was no apparent motive for her doing so. If she was above ground, she must certainly have seen the handbills, if not the papers, and she could hardly help hearing something about the one topic of conversation throughout Australia. Notwithstanding all this, Sal Rawlins was still undiscovered, and Colton, in despair, began to think that she must be dead. But Madge Frettlby was still hopeful. "God will not permit an innocent man to be sent to his death," she declared. Mr. Colton, to whom she said this, shook his head doubtfully. "God has permitted it to take place before, and we can only judge the future by the past." At last the day of the long-expected trial came, and as Colton sat in his office looking over his brief, a clerk entered and told him that Mr. Frettlby and his daughter wished to speak to him. When they came in, the barrister saw that the millionaire looked haggard and ill, and there was a worried expression on his face. "It is my daughter, Colton," he said after hurried greetings had been exchanged. "She wants to be present in court during Fitzgerald's trial, and nothing I can say will dissuade her." Colton turned and looked at the girl in some surprise. She met his look steadily, though her face was very pale. "Yes, I must be there. I shall go mad with anxiety unless I know how the trial goes on." Colton looked at Mr. Frettlby. "I am afraid you must consent," he said. "Very well. I shall leave her in your charge, Colton." The lawyer nodded. "And you?" "I'm not coming. I don't care to see a man whom I've had at my dinner table in the prisoner's dock, much as I sympathize with him. Good day." And with a curt nod he took his leave. When the door closed on her father, Madge placed her hand on Colton's arm. "Is there any hope?" "The merest chance. We have done everything in our power to discover this girl, but without result. If she does not come at the 11th hour, I'm afraid Brian Fitzgerald is a doomed man." Madge fell on her knees with a stifled cry. "Oh, God of mercy, save him! Save my darling!" She dropped her face in her hands and wept convulsively. The lawyer touched her lightly on the shoulder. "Come, be the brave girl you were, and we may save him yet. The hour is darkest before the dawn, you know." Madge dried her tears and followed the lawyer to the cab which was waiting for them at the door. They drove quickly up to the court, and Colton put her in a quiet place where she could see the dock and yet be unobserved by the people. Just as he was leaving her, she touched his arm. Tell him I'm here." Colton nodded and hurried away to put on his wig and gown. The court was crowded with fashionable Melbourne of both sexes, and they were all talking together in subdued whispers. The popular character of the prisoner, his good looks, and engagement to Madge Frettlby, together with the extraordinary circumstances of the case, had raised public curiosity to the highest pitch. The judge entered, and the court rose. When the prisoner was brought in, there was a great flutter among the ladies, and some of them even had the bad taste to produce opera glasses. Brian was dressed in black and looked pale and worn, but all the ladies declared that he was as good-looking as ever, and they were sure he was innocent. The jury were sworn in, and the Crown Prosecutor rose to deliver his opening address. The ladies ceased to talk, the men to stare round, and nothing could be seen but row after row of eager and attentive faces. The Crown Prosecutor was not a great orator, but he spoke clearly and distinctly, and every word could be heard in the dead silence. He gave a rapid sketch of the crime, and then proceeded to enumerate the witnesses for the prosecution. Once he had fully shown the chain of evidence which he proposed to prove, he called the first witness, the driver of the cab in which the fatal attack took place, Malcolm Royston. Royston, on being sworn, gave the same evidence as he had given at the inquest, from the time that the cab was hailed up to his arrival at the St Kilda police station with the dead body of White. In the cross-examination, Colton asked him if he was prepared to swear that the man who hailed the cab and the man who later returned and got in with the deceased were one and the same person. "I am." "You are quite certain?" "Yes, quite certain." "Do you then recognize the prisoner as the man who hailed the cab?" "I cannot swear to that. The gentleman who hailed the cab had his hat pulled down over his eyes so that I could not see his face. But the height and general appearance of the prisoner are the same." "The man who got into the cab was dressed as the prisoner was on that night?" "Yes." "And that is the only reason why you thought they were both the same person?" "It never struck me for a minute that they were not the same. Besides, he spoke as if he had been there before. I said, 'Oh, you've come back,' and he said, 'Yes, I'm going to take him home,' and got into my cab." "Did you notice any difference in his voice?" "No, except that the first time I saw him he spoke in a loud voice, and when he come back, very low." "You were sober, I suppose?" "Yes, sir, quite sober." "You did not have a drink, say at the Oriental Hotel, which I believe is near the rank where your cab stands?" "Well, I might have had a glass." "So you might. You might have had several." "Well, there's no law against a cove feeling thirsty." "Certainly not." "And I suppose you took advantage of the absence of such a law?" "Yes, I did." "And you were elevated?" "Yeah, I was sitting up on my cab." "You are here to give evidence, sir, not to make jokes however clever they may be. Were you or were you not slightly the worse for drink?" "I might have been." "So, you were in such a condition that you did not observe very closely the man who hailed you?" "No, I didn't. There was no reason why I should. I didn't know a murder was going to be committed." "And it never struck you that it might be a different man who actually got into your cab?" "No. I thought it was the same man the whole time." This closed Royston's evidence, and Colton sat down very dissatisfied at not being able to elicit anything more definite from him. One thing appeared clear, that someone must have dressed himself to resemble Brian and have spoken in a low voice for fear of betraying himself. The second cabman, Clement Rankin, was the next witness. He deposed to having picked up the prisoner on the St Kilda road between 1 and 2 on Friday morning and driving him to Powlett Street, East Melbourne. In the cross-examination, Colton elicited one point in the prisoner's favour. "Is the prisoner the same gentleman you drove to Powlett Street?" "Oh, yes." "How do you know? Did you see his face?" "No. His hat was pulled down over his eyes, and I could only see the ends of his moustache and his chin. But he carried himself the same as the prisoner, and the prisoner's moustache is the same light colour." "When you drove up to him on the St Kilda road, was he wearing gloves?" "He had one on the left hand, but the other was bare." "Did he wear any rings on the right hand?" "Yes, a large diamond one on the forefinger." "Are you sure?" "Yes, because I thought it a curious place for a gentleman to wear a ring, and when he was paying me my fare, I saw the diamond glitter on his finger in the moonlight." "That will do." Mrs. Hableton, the landlady of the deceased, was then called, and deposed that Oliver White had lodged with her for nearly 2 months. He seemed a quiet enough young man, but often came home drunk. The only friend she knew he had was a Mr. Morland, who was often with him. On the 14th of July, the prisoner called to see Mr. White, and they had a quarrel. She heard White say, "She is mine, you can't do anything with her," and the prisoner answered, "I can kill you, and if you marry her I shall do so in the open street." There was a great sensation in the court at these words, and half the people present looked upon such evidence as being sufficient in itself to prove the guilt of the prisoner. In cross-examination, Colton was unable to shake the evidence of the witness, as she merely reiterated the same statements over and over again. The next witness was Brian Fitzgerald's landlady, Mrs. Sampson, who crackled into the witness box, dissolved in tears, and gave her answers in a piercingly shrill tone of anguish. She stated that the prisoner was in the habit of coming home early, but on the night of the murder had come in shortly before 2 o'clock. The Crown Prosecutor consulted his notes. "You mean shortly after 2? "Having made a mistake once by saying 5 minutes after 2 to the policeman as called himself an insurance agent, I ain't a-going to do so again. It was 5 minutes afore 2, as I can swear." "You are sure your clock was right?" "It hadn't been, but me nevvy, being a watchmaker, called unbeknown to me and made it right on Thursday night, which it still was on Friday morning when Mr. Fitzgerald come home." Mrs. Sampson bravely stuck to this statement and ultimately left the witness box in triumph, the rest of her evidence being comparatively unimportant as compared with this point of time. The witness Rankin was recalled, and when questioned by the Crown Prosecutor, gave evidence that it was exactly 2 o'clock when the man with the diamond ring got down from his cab in Powlett Street and paid his fare. "How do you know that?" "Because I heard the post office clock strike. I heard the chimes and then the hour quite plainly." This conflicting evidence as to time was a strong point in Brian's favour. If he had come into his house at 5 minutes to 2, he could not possibly be the man who had alighted from Rankin's cab at 2 o'clock at Powlett Street. The next witness was Dr. Chinston, who swore to the death of the deceased by means of chloroform administered in a large quantity, and he was followed by Mr. Gorby, who deposed as to the finding of the glove belonging to the deceased in the pocket of the prisoner's coat. Roger Morland, the intimate friend of the late Oliver White, was next called to face questions from the prosecutor. He stated that he had known the deceased in London and had met him again in Melbourne. He was with him a great deal. On the night of the murder he was in the Orient Hotel in Burke Street when White came in, greatly excited. "You then had a drink with him?" "Several drinks. Then we went up to an hotel in Russell Street and had some more drinks there." "In short, the two of you were intoxicated?" "We were very drunk, yes." "What befell in the hotel bar in Russell Street?" "White took off his coat. He said he was too hot. When he left, he forgot to take it with him. I followed him out, but he wasn't to be seen." "What happened to the coat?" "Some blackguard snatched it out of my hands and ran off with it." In cross-examination, Colton asked, "What was the deceased excited about when you met him?" "I don't know. He did not say." "What did you talk about?" "All sorts of things. London, principally." "Did the deceased mention anything about a document, an important private paper?" "No, he did not." "Are you sure?" "Quite sure." "What time did you get home?" "I don't know. I was too drunk to remember." Mr. Roger Morland's testimony closed the case for the Crown, and as it was now late, the trial was adjourned till the next day. The opinions of all were pretty well divided, some being in favour of Fitzgerald and others against, when suddenly an event happened which surprised everyone. All over Melbourne the news passed from lip to lip like wildfire. Sal Rawlins had been found. Sal Rawlins had made her appearance at the 11th hour, to the heartfelt thankfulness of Colton, who saw in her an angel from heaven sent to save the life of an innocent man. At the close of the court, the lawyer and Madge had gone down to his office when a clerk entered with a telegram from the detective Kilsip. Colton opened it hastily, and with a silent look of pleasure on his face, handed the telegram to Miss Frettlby. She, being more impulsive, gave a cry when she read it, and falling on her knees, thanked God for having heard her prayers. "Take me to her at once," she implored the lawyer. She was anxious to hear from Sal Rawlins' own lips the joyful words which would save Brian from a felon's death. "No, my dear. I can hardly take a lady to the place where Sal Rawlins lives. You will know all tomorrow, but meanwhile you must go home and get some sleep." Madge clasped her hands on Colton's arm. "You will tell him?" "At once. And I will see Sal Rawlins tonight." Brian heard the good news with a deep feeling of gratitude, knowing that his life was saved and that he could still keep his secret. And yet, in spite of his joy at being delivered from the hangman's rope, there mingled with his delight the horror of that secret which the dying woman had told him. "I had rather she had died in silence than she should have bequeathed me this legacy of sorrow," he thought. While Brian was pacing up and down his cell during the weary watches of the night, and Madge, in her own room, was kneeling beside her bed and thanking God for his great mercy, Colton, the good fairy of the two lovers, was hurrying towards the humble abode of Mrs. Rawlins, familiarly known as Mother Guttersnipe. Kilsip was beside him. "What I like," observed Kilsip, "is the blow it will be for that Gorby. He was so certain that Mr. Fitzgerald was the man, and when he gets off tomorrow, Gorby will be in a rage." Colton was not listening to what the detective was saying. "Where was the girl the whole time?" he asked. "Ill. After she left Sydney, she went into the country, caught cold by falling into some river, and ended up by getting brain fever. Some people found her, took her in and nursed her. When she got well, she came back to her grandmother's. And since it had occurred to me to keep watch on the house in the case of just such an eventuality, it was I who observed her arrival. She turned up tonight at 5 o'clock, looking more like a corpse than anything else." When they entered the squalid, dingy passage that led to Mother Guttersnipe's abode, they saw a faint light streaming down the stair. As they climbed up, they could hear the rancorous voice of the old hag pouring forth alternate blessings and curses on her prodigal offspring, and the low tones of a girl's voice in reply. On entering the room, Colton saw that the sick woman who had been lying in the corner on the occasion of his last visit was gone. Mother Guttersnipe was seated in front of the deal table with a broken cup and her favourite bottle of spirits before her. She evidently intended to have a night of it, in order to celebrate Sal's return, and had commenced early, so as to lose no time. Sal herself was seated on a broken chair and leaned wearily against the wall. She stood up as Colton and the detective entered, and they saw that she was a tall, slender woman of about 25, not bad-looking, but with a pallid and haggard appearance from her recent illness. She was clothed in a kind of tawdry blue dress, much soiled and torn, and had over her shoulders an old tartan shawl, which she drew tightly across her breast as the strangers entered. Her grandmother, who looked more weird and grotesquely horrible than ever, saluted Colton and the detective on their entrance with a shrill yell and a volley of choice language. Kilsip paid no attention to the old fury, but turned to the girl. "This is the gentleman who wants to speak to you," he said, making her sit on the chair again, for indeed she looked too ill to stand. "Just tell him what you told me." Sal fixed her wild, weak eyes on Colton. "About the Queen, sir?" "Yes, Sal. Tell me all that happened on the night you brought Mr. Fitzgerald to see the Queen." "She gave me the letter for him and says to me, 'Don't you ask no questions and you won't hear no lies. Just deliver it and then wait for him and do as he says.'" "And what did he ask you to do?" "He came up to me and says, 'Take me to her.' So I took him." "And what did he do when he came here?" "He goes right up to her and she says, 'Are you him?' And he says, 'I am.' Then she says, 'Do you know why I'm going to tell you?' And he says, 'No.' Then she says, 'It's about that Madge Frettlby.'" "It's about her. You're sure?" "Oh, yes, sir, I'm sure." And he turns very white and says, "How dare you have her name on your vile lips?" And she gets up and screeches, "Turn that gal out and I'll tell you." And he takes me by the arm and says, "Get out," and I gets out, and that's all I knows. "How long was he with her?" "About half hour." "And he was in with her the whole time?" "I was at that door," said Sal, pointing to it, and he couldn't have got out without me seeing him. Colton nodded to Kilsip. It's all right. There won't be any difficulty in proving an alibi. Then he turned once more to Sal. What were they talking about? I don't know. They talks that quiet I couldn't hear 'em. Then he sings out, "My God, it's too horrible," and I hear her laughing like to bust. And then he comes to me and says, quite wild-like, "Take me out of this hell." And I took him back to where he met me. Then I come back home. And what happened when you came back here? She was dead. "And I never knowed I was in the room with a corpse," wailed Mother Guttersnipe, waking up. "Catch her! She was always a-doing contrary things." Colton looked firmly at the sick girl. "Sal, is all this the truth?" "So help me. He's here that whole time." Next morning the court was crowded, and numbers were unable to gain admission. When the prisoner was brought in, a murmur of sympathy ran through the crowded court, so ill and worn out he looked. But Colton was puzzled to account for the expression of his face, so different from that of a man whose life had been saved, or rather was about to be saved. "You know who stole that document," he thought, as he looked at Fitzgerald keenly, "and the man who did so is the murderer of White." The judge having entered and the court being opened, Colton rose to make his speech and stated in a few words the line he intended to take. Then he called his first witness for the defence, Albert Dendy. Dendy, duly sworn, stated, "I am a watchmaker and carry on business in Fitzroy. I remember Thursday, the 26th of July last. On the evening of that day, I called at Powlett Street in East Melbourne to see my aunt, who is the landlady of the prisoner. She was out at the time I called, and I waited in the kitchen till her return. I looked at the kitchen clock to see if it was too late to wait, and then at my watch. I found that the clock was 10 minutes fast, upon which I put it right and regulated it properly." And then Sal Rawlins was placed in the witness box, and after having been sworn, gave her vital evidence. Following her statement, the Crown Prosecutor rose to cross-examination. "You are quite certain that the prisoner was the man you met on that night?" "Quite certain. So help me God." "You say that after you delivered the letter, the accused met you at a few minutes past 1 o'clock?" "Yeah, about 5 minutes after." "How can you be so sure of the time?" "'Cause I heard the clock striking 1 just before he come down the street." "And later, after his visit to your house, when you took him back to the same spot and left him there, you claim it was about 25 to 2, is that correct?" "It were 25 to 2. "How could you possibly know the time so accurately?" "'Cause it took me 10 minutes to get home, and I heard the clock go 3/4 to 2 just as I gets to the door. And before that, when I was with him, I saw the post office clock as plain as day, and when I gets into Swanston Street, I looks at the town hall clock and sees the time there." This closed the evidence for the defence. After the Crown Prosecutor had made his speech, in which he pointed out the strong evidence against the prisoner, Colton arose to address the jury. He was a fine speaker and made a splendid defence. Not a single point escaped him, and that brilliant piece of oratory is still remembered and spoken of admiringly in the purlieus of Temple Court and Chancery Lane. Colton wound up his elaborate and exhaustive speech, which lasted for over 2 hours, with a brilliant peroration, calling upon the jury to base their verdict upon the plain facts of the case, and if they did so, they could hardly fail in bringing in a verdict of not guilty. When Colton sat down, a subdued murmur of applause was heard, which was instantly suppressed, and the judge began to sum up strongly in favour of Fitzgerald. The jury then retired. The hour being late, the gas had been lighted, and there was a sickly glare through the wide hall. Fitzgerald had been taken out of court on the retiring of the jury, but the spectators stared steadily at the empty dock, which seemed to enchain them by some indescribable fascination. They conversed among themselves in whispers until even the whispering ceased, and nothing could be heard but the steady ticking of the clock, and now and then the quick-drawn breath of some timid onlooker. Suddenly a woman, whose nerves were overstrung, shrieked, and the cry rang weirdly through the crowded hall. She was taken out, and again there was silence, every eye being now fixed on the door through which the jury would reissue with their verdict of life or death. The hands of the clock moved slowly round. A quarter, a half, 3/4, and then the hour sounded with a silvery ring which startled everyone. Madge, sitting with her hands tightly clasped together, began to fear that her highly strung nerves would give way. "My God," she muttered softly to herself, "will this suspense never end?" Just then the door opened, and the jury re-entered. The prisoner was again placed in the dock, and the judge resumed his seat, this time with the black cap in his pocket, as everyone guessed. The usual formalities were gone through, and when the foreman of the jury stood up, every neck was craned forward and every ear was on the alert to catch the words that fell from his lips. The prisoner flushed a little, and then grew pale as death. Then came the verdict, sharp and decisive. "Not guilty."